Hey everyone, welcome back to the REI Marketing Secrets podcast. Today on the show, we have Angela Duncan. And Angela, for our audience out there who is just learning about yourself for the very first time, do you mind just giving us a little bit of your background and how you got started in real estate?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Section 8 housing and welfare. So my mom was a single mom. So I definitely didn't learn about money early on. There wasn't anybody there to teach me. But I was a very curious person. And you started just to pay attention to my surroundings and noticing like people on vacations or having nicer houses and nicer cars. And I thought, like, how do they have money? And so I kind of went on this quest. I went to college. It took 5 years for me to put myself through college. I moved out when I was 18 years old, and I started to learn about finance and about money. And I had a job at Bank of America, and this lady walks in, and I'm a teller at the time, and she goes to make a deposit, and the check was like $40,000. Well, I'd never seen a check that big before. So I asked her, I was like, what do you do? And she says, oh, I'm a real estate agent. And I thought, okay, that's where I need to be because obviously they make money. So I got my real estate license in 2007. If you can imagine where the market was at that time, it was right before, kind of the crash of the market. And I had to really quickly shift and learn. But I've always been great with numbers. So real estate investing and working with investors for me was a lot more fun than taking a buyer out and trying to help them choose what color the kitchen was going to be. So I started working with investors, and then I started investing myself in single family properties. But I didn't like having to deal with tenants. If they can't pay the rent, I have a heart. I want to let them slide maybe a week or two. And well, you just can't do that, right? You have to be able to treat all your tenants the same. I was tired of getting phone calls about toilets on Christmas because they had all their family over and the toilet overflowed. So I thought there's got to be a different way for me to invest in real estate. At the time, my ex-husband and I, we owned a Remax office, and it was one of the top in the country. So I started just asking other people, like, what other avenues are there about real estate so I can get out of this single family tenant full-time job that I had, right? So I picked up a book called The 16% Solution and just started to read about tax liens. And that's kind of how my journey on tax liens started.
Yeah, I think that's really a fascinating story. And it's funny, I went out and I went and got my real estate license when I was in college. Never did anything with it. And I was thinking maybe I could use it to invest in real estate and realize it's a whole different ball game. But I went out and got it over in Massachusetts at the time where I was living. It was like a 40-hour course, so I just did 8 5-hour days when I think in college they give you like 6 to 8 weeks off in between semesters, which was pretty nuts. But that's interesting going from being the real estate agent to now working with investors, and I can definitely see that. And then it's funny that you mentioned that you didn't want to necessarily deal with tenants anymore, and that's why I've gone down that passive investing route too. I never did anything active. I thought to myself, I would be. I mean, I know we're talking about passive investing, but I would be too passive to the tenants. If they don't pay rent, I have a hard time kicking them out. And I'm like, I'm not that type of person. And if I was starting, I'd probably start small. I wouldn't go out and buy a big apartment complex, so I'd be self-managing them. And that's where it sort of took me down this passive route. And that's where I came across these mortgage notes. And I invest through a company that helps me, I wouldn't say place my money, but it's more of a mortgage note fund that I invest through. But I'm curious, why sort of tax liens and mortgage notes? I know you mentioned single family rentals, but over, say, the other asset classes out there like multifamily or self storage or mobile home park? Is it more just not really having to deal with any tenants? Is it the returns for the amount of effort put in? Just curious why you gravitated towards tax liens.
Yeah, a couple reasons. I've also done the apartment buildings. I've also done syndications and giving my money to people. And if anyone's been paying attention to the real estate market this past couple years with interest rates, how they rose so quickly, I've had quite a few, and myself included, apartment complexes go into foreclosure. You never really think that that's going to happen, but when you buy yourself, you buy an asset like an apartment complex and you obtain a loan, most times they're getting an adjustable rate loan. So some of these apartment complexes went from having a 2%, 2.5% loan to 7%, right? That's something that we had absolutely no control over as an investor, but the interest rate tripled. Well, we can't triple rental rates. So again, I have got no control over this. And now, if you can't afford to pay the mortgage, well, the bank's going to take it back. Just like if you can't afford to pay for your home, the bank is going to take it back, right? And so that was a reason why I really wanted to shift to something that was more conservative. Tax liens, for the audience that may not know what it is, if you own a piece of property, you have to pay property taxes, whether it's a house, condo, mobile home, apartment complex, commercial property, you're going to pay taxes to the government. And if you can't pay taxes, well, they still need their money. The government has a budget. They have to pay for police officers and pave roads and all of these things. So that's when an investor comes in. What the government does is they give you this piece of paper called a tax lien. And as an investor, I come in and I give them money for that tax lien, which helps fund their budget. In return, I get a guaranteed interest rate. So depending on the state that you live in, I'm more of an expert in Florida. That's where I invest my dollars. In Florida, they pay a minimum of 5% up to 18%. And all I really need to do is I have my process that I go through in May of every year. I do my bidding online. And then if I'm awarded the tax lien, then I hold on to it until the time in which hopefully that property owner pays back the taxes that they owe. I get my money back plus the interest rate that the government has guaranteed to give me. I don't have to fix and flip properties. I'm not worried about foreclosure because there's no bank involved. I'm just paying for a tax lien. I don't have to get my hands dirty. I don't have to worry about talking to tenants. None of that. I literally go through my process in May, make my bids, and then I sit back and wait for the government to give the money back to me that I've given to them as an investment with that interest rate that's guaranteed.
And I know you mentioned the month of May. Is that just because that's the only time of year that it's being offered? Maybe they put them all on the sort of thing like a marketplace. However, Florida does it through their government website. Is that just the one time of year that they allowed betting on it?
Yeah, so your property taxes come out in November and you have until April to pay your taxes. And once a year has passed, so say for example, you bought a home this year, right? We're in 2024 and you didn't pay your taxes come April of next year. Well, the following year is when that tax certificate comes up for sale. And yes, it's an online process. It opens for 30 days from May 1st till the end of May. And it gives you enough time to see the list of tax liens that are available for purchase and to do your own due diligence process, which I do have. And then I make the bid. And so once the bidding closes, if a tax lien certificate gets bid on, and the government is going to look for one thing: who is offering to accept the lowest interest rate. So think about this. When you log into that platform and I pick 123 Main Street, right? I'm bidding on that tax lien. Well, the only thing I'm bidding on is not the dollar amount, because that's already fixed. The government has told us how much his taxes are due. What I'm bidding on is how much interest rate I'm willing to accept. So you can bid anything from 0 up to 18%. So it just depends on your process, what kind of investor you are. You're going into this knowing that, I'm going to accept this interest rate. So then the government chooses the winning bid, and then you have to pay that money right away to them so that we can close out the process.
And I would imagine that if you're going 0 to 18% interest, would 18% be you're looking at it and you deem that it's more risky versus offering 2%? I would imagine. And I sort of think of it like bonds. You can go through and get your AAA bonds, and you're going to get, or your government bonds, municipal bonds. They're paying 1 to 2%, or you could go more junk bonds and they're paying a little bit higher. Obviously, more risk, more reward. When it comes to your portfolio of building them out, do you like a mixture of both, or is there you just want to say, hey, I just want to get 10% and that's what I'm bidding on all of them, or does it really just fluctuate depending on what happens come month of May every single year?
Yeah. So for me, I have my own strategy. My strategy is, one, I'm looking for a single family home. I do not want a condo, a townhome. I do not want anything that's in an HOA, because an HOA, if you're not paying your property taxes, likely the homeowner's not paying their HOA. I don't want to have to deal with them. So I'm looking for a single family home, and I'm looking for an area that still is pretty high sales, meaning I can look on Zillow and I can see properties that are going up for sale and that are being sold in a median price range area. So that's one of my criterias. And also, I'm looking for a home that has a homestead, meaning the person that living in that property, that's the home that they live in, because I don't want to have to foreclose on them later. That's not my strategy. A lot of people may choose to pick tax liens so that they can go through that foreclosure process. I understand you could make more money, but for me, that's not passive. So again, I want to keep my strategy as passive as possible. I'm looking for the homeowner that is most likely to pay their taxes at some point. Reasons why a homeowner may not have paid their taxes. Maybe they had a death in the family, maybe they got sick, maybe they lost their job, and so they're just not able to pay it at that moment. But my strategy and the reason why I pick a homeowner that lives in the property is most likely they're going to pay their taxes on their property because they do not want to go through the foreclosure process and lose that home. So you've got to determine what kind of investor you are and work through and make that process before you even start bidding on any tax liens.
Yeah, I think that's important to note there. Where if I'm going through and I'm being a passive investor, I don't want to have to foreclose on someone. I feel like I would feel really bad about having to do that. So I'd rather them be able to pay those taxes back over time, and I'm still able to make my money. And it's funny that you mentioned looking at maybe there's a death in the family, maybe something's going on in their life. And I think that's important to look at. I know when I was investing in a particular deal, and it wasn't tax liens, it was a triple net lease offering. But when I did a background check, they had a couple different tax liens on their properties. And when I brought it up to the person, they were going through a divorce, and the properties were caught up in a divorce, and that's why where I know the guy or this particular gentleman, I know he would make good on it. He had a successful real estate company, and it was 10 years ago when it happened, so it wasn't anything recent. But I think you make some good points there on wanting to keep it more of your passive investment. Now you have your tax liens, which sounds like you're going through and people aren't paying their property taxes, and you're coming through and you know buying those from them in essence per se, or helping the government out, I should mention. Now, do you invest in mortgage notes where you're going through and potentially buying people's mortgages and then owner financing it back to them? Or like the mortgage note fund that I'm part of, maybe someone's paying $1,500 a month at 5% interest, and they can't make those payments. So they'll come in and they'll say, okay, we're going to lower your payments down to $1,000 a month, but now we're going to bump up the rate to 10%. So they're doubling the rate, but they're lowering the payment, and that's how they make their spread on the deal. Do you also invest in mortgage notes besides tax liens?
I do not, and here's why. I live in Florida, and I highly recommend that you invest where you live, or at least in the state that you live. If you know anything about foreclosure law in Florida, it's not as friendly as some of the other states, and it could take you several years to foreclose. So, say in that instance, if your person stops making payments, well, if you have to go through that foreclosure process, you could be without a cash flow for 2 years because that's the time that it might take for you, especially if it's a primary home in the state of Florida. So it's really important for you to understand the local laws or the laws in which the area in which you're investing. So because I live in Florida, I'm understanding a lot more about Florida laws. I wouldn't go out to like Georgia or somewhere else to invest at this point because there's plenty of opportunity in Florida. But mortgage notes for me is too risky of an investment, and I'm very conservative. So I want to go somewhere where I know if I have to foreclose or if I have to go through a process, then I understand what the local laws are.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. That's why I do these mortgage notes through a company where I don't have to worry, where I know the spread's going to be a little bit less than what I could probably make going out there and doing it on my own. But again, I want to be passive and not have to go out there and necessarily have to foreclose on someone or someone falls behind on their payments. And it seems like it's a pretty big process. They have to go out and hire an attorney to send them letters, and it seems like this big ordeal where maybe they make 1 or 2% on them on the money that I'm basically lending to them for this deal. But when it comes to the tax liens themselves, is there a certain dollar amount that someone needs to get started? And I'm just thinking, I know you mentioned you don't invest in mortgage notes, but from the mortgage note side, like at least the fund that I was investing in, it was like a 25K minimum. I've been talking to other people that specialize in mortgage notes where I can get a partial note for 40K. I would imagine the property taxes are probably a little bit higher in Florida and New York, just given the area where our mine are relatively cheap just being in New York. I don't have to worry about too many natural weather events occurring where I am. But I would imagine that the property taxes probably aren't 40, 50K a year down there. So curious what it looks like for someone to get started going out and buying these tax liens. If there's a certain amount you'd recommend, whether it's 5K, 10K, 20K, what that sort of looks like.
Yeah, that's one of the great things about tax lien investing is that you can start with a lot less dollar amount than some of the other alternative investments when it comes to real estate. Property taxes on a condo, on a townhome, they could be as low as $500. And so you could be purchasing a tax lien for $500. So the entry to get into tax liens is much lower. So that makes it easier for someone who wants to get into the real estate field, who wants something passive, who wants something that's more conservative. It's backed by the government. You still are, the government government's going to pay you that taxes back plus that interest rate. So that dollar amount to start investing is much lower, and you're not doing any type of partial, right? So when you're purchasing the tax liens yourself and you're going on and making those bids, you own that tax lien. Unless, of course, say you put together your own fund, or maybe you put together an LLC with a group of people and you all put your money together so that you could buy more tax liens. But as an individual investor, you could start with maybe $500, $1,000. So it's much easier to get started with when you don't have a lot of funds to start.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It's nice, especially early on where you're an investor and you're just looking to get started. And what I like about it, and something you mentioned, is the interest rates within the multifamily space. That area has definitely scared me away, just given everything that's happened in there. And I've been looking at other outside asset classes, and I haven't invested in tax liens, but it's definitely interesting because I feel as though there's not as much volatility. Is really, what would you say is the biggest risk here? Would it just be the person not paying back their property taxes and then you have to go on and foreclose it? Is there a potential where you could lose all your money? Where I know in real estate, I've definitely seen people lose all their money in those deals. I feel as though there might be a little less risk, as most multifamily syndications, you're looking at 50K to 100K, where it sounds like with these tax liens, you can definitely get started with a little less. Is there certain risks that people should be aware of? Maybe their money could get tied up. Again, talking to the expert and yourself here, it's just spitballing, but curious if there are any risks that someone should be, aware of when they're investing in tax liens.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you don't understand the process, a tax lien is in first position. So even if there's a mortgage on the property or HOA dues, or say the grass is overgrowing and the county put a lien on it with some fees, tax lien is first in line. The risk is this: if you haven't done your proper research, there is one that's going to be in front of a tax lien, and that's a federal lien. So say, for example, your homeowner didn't pay their federal taxes, that gets paid first. So that's risk number one. You really have to get with a title company and make sure that you're doing all of your research and due diligence before you bid. That way you understand what could potentially be in front of you. So tax lien risk one is federal income tax lien. Two is if the homeowner decides to file bankruptcy. The reason why that's a risk is because when you go through bankruptcy, the court might say all of your assets are liquidated and make a list of everybody that's owed. Usually the government is pretty high up on that list to get their payment first, but if there's not enough money on the table to pay back everybody, you may not get paid. So that's risk number two. Number three is in the state of Florida, there can be multiple tax lien certificates issued. Like I said, the foreclosure process timeline in Florida could be 2 additional years after that first year they became delinquent. So there could be 3 tax lien certificates out there. If I buy tax lien number 3 and someone goes through the foreclosure process, and again, not enough money on the table for me to get my funds back, then I could risk losing my money. So there is risk involved, but when you go through the due diligence properly in the beginning and understand what the process might look like, then you're really mitigating those risks and kind of taking them away. But there are always risks involved. The great thing about tax liens, though, is that this is the government, and the government pays their bills, because what do? They print money, right? So if they've got bills to pay, they're going to pay it. The only reason why they may not pay it is because of one of those other risks that I just spoke about.
Yeah, I think even those risks are, I feel as though they're very minimal compared to seeing some of these risks I see in the multifamily space. Not to harp on multifamily, but that's just the asset class that always comes to mind, that's had quite a little bit of trouble. And I feel like with these tax liens, you have more control over by doing your due diligence, where I can do my due diligence, but if the sponsor is, maybe they're tweaking a number a little bit on their spreadsheet, I don't happen to catch it, that they want to inflate, say, your IRR or just the overall return, I might not catch that, or maybe something's going on with the property and I don't have any voting rights, or whatever it may be, where I feel as though with these tax liens, you have a little bit more control over it. Not to say, it's like any investment. You can invest in stocks and it could go down. You could lose some capital. But I feel as though as you have your due diligence that you're putting into place here, that you're really going to be able to limit your risk as compared to some of these other investments out there. And do you think it's possible for someone to start investing in these tax liens and say within 5 to 10 years they could replace their W-2 income? Is it on a slow track? Could they speed it up if they just decide, hey, I want to throw more money at this? Curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, if they've got a good amount of cash to start investing with, and they have done their proper due diligence, understanding what the risks are, going through and bidding on properties and getting the properties, but you're not going to get that cash flow right away. It's going to come to you at some point in the future, so you have to understand that, and you've got to have some additional sources of income while you're waiting for that. Now, if you stack it, say I'm doing the bidding 5 years in a row, chances are I'm going to have pretty consistent redemptions coming back to me with the tax liens plus the interest rate. But it all gets paid at the end. It's not something that gets paid to you monthly or quarterly. It gets paid to you once that the property owner pays for that tax that they owe. And then the government gives you that plus your interest rate back. So this is not really a cash flow strategy. It's really a building wealth strategy, so that you need to understand you've got to, if cash flow is what you need today, then you need to have some other source of income that's coming in.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful to know for audience because I always like to look at most investments either being cash flow or, in my mind, an equity play, which is, I guess this is kind of similar to what you'd think of an equity play where you get paid more. You put your money in now, and then you typically get more than a cash flow play, but it's just going to take a little bit longer to get that capital. But that's super helpful to know for our audience. And now I want to dive a little bit into your podcast. I know you have one of the top rated podcasts out there. I believe I want to make sure I get the name right. Is it Empower Her Money Podcast?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. I was looking at my notes. I was like, "Oh man, I forgot to write. I forgot to write it down." But I know I was doing my research earlier this week and wanted to make sure I had that. But curious how that podcast has been and what you talk about on that show and what our audience may benefit from going over and checking out the podcast.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things I mentioned in my story is my mom was a single mom, and, she didn't take the time, or perhaps there wasn't anybody around her that taught her about money. And I find that is very common. On my podcast a few months ago, I interviewed a woman who specializes in divorces specifically for women. And she was giving me some astounding statistics. How many women, about 70% of women who go through divorce, end up on some type of government assistance after the divorce. They're used to a certain type of lifestyle. Maybe they had to go back and get a job. Statistics show us that women make less money than men, that we save less, we invest less. So it really, to me, comes down to education. How do we reach more people and provide them the education that they need so that they don't have to go through that? So they're not looking for government assistance, so that they can pay their bills, teach their children, and provide wealth for their family and live a lifestyle that they wish to do, right? So for me, podcasting, just like what you're doing right here, is a way for us to teach people. It's a platform that reaches people globally. YouTube is free, Spotify is free. You can give this information out to people who want to learn. And it's just an amazing way for us to share stories, to teach people, and use a platform that's readily available to most people in the world, so that we can make an impact. We can teach, we can give back, and really just support each other on your journey, whatever that looks like to you. Understanding that we are here, you can ask us questions, you can get the information that you need, but this is just the best way for us to be able to reach more people is through podcasts.
That's that's awesome, and it's always been fascinating to me. Where I've always had the personal finance background. Initially, went to college to major in finance, and always been about managing money. And I feel as though I'm very good at it. But it's interesting to me how many people have a hard time managing money, and it's not that they don't want to do a good job managing their money. It's more they just don't know what they don't know. And I find that's where you can bring that to light, where you bring guests on your show, or maybe you're just talking about these different financial topics that like some things I find that so simple, like in friends and family, like just using a credit card every month and just doing the minimum balance and never paying it off, and you're looking at a 30% APR, and you're like, you're killing me here. If you're going to use a credit card, at least just make sure you pay it off in full at the end of the month, and just simple things like that, where it's just, hey, I'm paying the minimum balance, the card's getting paid, I don't see any problem with it. And it's like, well, you're paying $100 a month, and 90% of it's going to interest. It's going to take you quite a long time to get out of it. So it's really good that you have that podcast. I think that's something that's very beneficial to a lot of people out there. I know for me, learning personal finance has been the biggest factor for building wealth, just knowing how to stay out of debt. I know a lot of folks in the real estate space, hey, leverage yourself on everything. And for me, I'm like, I don't want to have too much debt. I know you're shaking your head here. Really, the only debt my wife and I have is just our mortgage. Everything else is, student loans paid off, credit, only use the credit card and just paid off every month. No car loans. I think we took like even a car loan we had it for 1 year, and just it was a $30,000 car loan. We put 20K down and then just took the remainder of the year to pay off the 10K, and now the car has like 40,000 miles on it, so it's going to be hopefully be around for a long time. But I feel as though so many people don't have those insights. And I know we're a real estate show, but curious what your best piece of financial advice would be for someone out there. Would it be staying out of debt? Would it be to start building wealth? What so and maybe you have more than one piece of advice, but just for our audience out there that is maybe looking, hey, maybe I'm in some debt. I don't know if I can invest in these tax liens. How do I get out of this debt so I start having that money where I can start investing it?
Yeah, great question. Tip number one is to invest in yourself first. If you're listening to this podcast, it's exactly what you're doing. I want you to think about investing in your own education as the most unselfish thing that you can do because you are bettering yourself. You're learning more for yourself. And that's important for you to do so that you can then turn around and teach others, teach your family, take care of your family, your friends, whoever is around you that's watching you. You may not know, but as you invest in your own education and get better at whatever strategy you choose to invest in, other people are going to become curious and it gives you a chance to impact lives around you. Two, whatever strategy you choose, whether it's real estate, stock market, and you're becoming the master of learning of that education, right? By investing in yourself, always have the exit plan in mind. So whether that's in business, that's in real estate investing, you have to know how you're going to get out of each of those so that some point in the future, you already have this plan lined out. So it's great for you to understand the process getting in, but you also should have an exit plan, whatever type of business or investing that you do. So those would be my top two tips.
Yeah, that's amazing. And for our audience out there, when it comes to real estate, same sort of thing, having an exit strategy, and that helps me to decide what investments am I going to do. Do I want more cash flow or do I want more equity down the line? So that's very beneficial for our audience. And Angela, I just want to say I really enjoyed our interview today. And if our audience is looking to learn more about you, where should they go to?
Yeah, you talked about my podcast, Empower Her Money's podcast on all streaming platforms. Would love for you to follow. I'm also on YouTube or Instagram, Empower Her Money.
Awesome. I'll make sure to include that in the show notes of today's episode. And Angela, again, thanks so much for coming on to the show today.
Thank you.